walked to the doorway before disappearing into the house. I lay there, unable to move, maybe another 10 to 20 seconds before my vision suddenly became more clear, and I was able to think more clearly as well. I was able to sit up. I jumped out of the bed, screaming "Mom" over and over. I ran to the bedroom hallway, yelling her name. A door opened down the hall, and someone came to hug me, but it wasn't my mom. It was my dad, telling me he misses her too. My mom died 3 weeks before this happened.
I'm never vacuuming at 4 a.m. anymore. That's for sure.
You know what I love about dreams? How vague and how bizarre they can be. You feel like you're in this separate world where things can just make no sense. Now, what about when that unearthliness transcends into the quote-unquote real world? You'll see what I mean in a minute. I was in REM sleep having this bizarre nightmare about being followed by some weird creature in the middle of the woods. The dream became fuzzy though, and I kind of woke up from it. I say kind of, because while I was out of the dream and back in my bed, I couldn't move a muscle in my body. I started hearing this faint, weird noise. It was this indescribable, robotic, yet alive type sound. It started light and soft, but it repeated every 3 seconds. I noticed it was getting slightly louder every time. I felt like the sound was getting closer. It got so unbearably loud in my head, I just wanted to scream, but I couldn't. Then my eyes locked onto the closet door, specifically the crack in the closet door, which I never leave open, ever. There was this distorted face of a man looking between the crack, with this unhumanly large open-mouthed smile, and every time I heard the noise, it seemed as if the closet and the face were getting closer, until the closet door slammed shut, and everything went silent. I regained control of my body shortly after that. The first thing I did, even though I was 24 years old, was run to my parents' room to get my dad to check the closet with me. There was nothing in the closet though, or the rest of my room. My dad seemed pretty confident that what I just experienced was sleep paralysis, and that he had experienced it once as well. Didn't make me feel any less disturbed about what I just went through. Many years ago, I had a sleep paralysis experience. I knew there was a thing in my closet, something really evil, but I also knew I was dreaming and I should face my fear. I tried not to look directly at the closet door, but if I moved my eyes, my head would turn away. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't look directly at it. Then I woke up in a cold sweat. At first I felt really relieved that it was over, but very shortly I realized it wasn't a dream, and there was really something in the closet. I was laying on my back and couldn't move. I didn't really hear it, but I could kind of feel the sickening laughter wash over me in waves, emanating from the closet. All of a sudden, the thing throws a human head at me, and it lands on my chest face up. It was this girl I knew in high school. Up to this point, I was kind of holding it together, terrified but not panicked. Well, I lose it now. I can't even scream. All I could do is make these grunting sounds and moaning noises. I'm wriggling and straining, trying to rock from side to side to get it off me, but I can't move. This seemed to last maybe another minute or two, and then I really woke up. It was so traumatic that for weeks I would be scared when I woke up that I wasn't actually awake, and something horrible could happen at any second. It still makes my skin crawl when I think about that laugh. The thing is, I never heard of sleep paralysis or night terrors at that point in my life. I thought I was losing my mind.
Really cold. So many alarm bells were going off in my head already. First, she just looked sort of sketchy.
I've suffered sleep paralysis a total of 3 times in my life. The first 2 times, it just consisted of me waking up not being able to move my body. The third time was much different though. I had woken up very early morning, probably like between 5 and 6 a.m., when the sun was just starting to come up. There was light in the room, but barely any. I tried to move, but I had that unfortunately familiar feeling of paralysis, helplessness. My eyes fixated on the wall. There was nothing I could do. Then suddenly, I heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs of my bedroom. It was my brother, followed by my sister, dad, and mom. They were all sobbing hysterically, and they all seemed to be at least a foot taller. It was unnerving. The four of them approached my bed, then stopped at the bedside, towering over me, all four of them crying. I couldn't move. I wanted to cry for help or just yell at them to stop because they were scaring me. Their heights, they looked like they were near to hitting the ceiling. Then, just as quickly as they entered, all four of them turned and walked back down the stairs. I could move again, and so I ran down the stairs to follow them, but they weren't in the outside area. We went to each of their rooms one at a time. All four of them were fast asleep. My heart was racing because the most surreal, unnerving thing just happened to me. I had to lean on the wall to gather my thoughts for a second, breathing heavily. Falling back asleep was futile the rest of the night. I lay awake until the sun was fully up. A few days later, I was struck by a speeding car when crossing the road with friends and ended up with 3 broken bones and a fractured thigh bone. I was hospitalized for a week, and at one point, all 4 of my family members stood next to my hospital bed, looking down at me, my mom being emotional and crying. It was almost the same image from my sleep paralysis. I'm not superstitious at all, but if I were, I would 100% believe that dream was some kind of sign, or some kind of prediction of the future. In fact, I just got chills writing that last sentence, thinking about it. There was this one time I was out late drinking with friends. It was some point in the summer of 2016. We were kind of just walking around town and then around the neighborhood when one of my friends spotted someone hiding in a bush. He pointed and said, "Look," and we all walked a little closer to get a better look. We could see what he was talking about, but just barely. It was bizarre, like someone hiding in this bush in front of this house. When we got too close, apparently, this weird, off-putting sound started coming from the bush. So we all screamed and laughed and ran away. We screamed because it was scary, but laughed because at the same time it was bizarrely funny. And there were a lot of us, so... Anyway, we walked back to our houses respectively, assuming whoever was in that bush was just messing with people. I fell asleep pretty easily that night since I was drunk. The next thing I remember was waking up to the near pitch blackness of my room. I couldn't look at the clock to see what time it was because I literally couldn't move. I was in a sleep paralysis state. I looked around the room with my eyes only and started to hear a familiar noise. The noise we heard coming from that bush. Then I looked straight in front of me, at the foot of my bed, and what I saw was pure nightmare fuel. It was what appeared to be this floating, grotesque, horrific head of a demonic ghost-like thing. As it got closer to me, I realized it wasn't floating. There was a body, but its body blended in with the blackness of the room. Its mouth hung open, and it just kept making the familiar noise from the bush. It got mere inches from my face before it suddenly just faded away. I was able to let out a scream and move my body. I sat in my bed, panting and heart racing. I flicked on the lamp and checked around my bed. That demonic thing was gone. What I just experienced seemed so real, like I was awake for it. It wasn't a dream. I told my parents about it the next day, and they agreed with me that it was sleep paralysis, though they had never heard of anyone seeing freaky shit like that before.
G'day mates, it's Bee-Busty. I would like to give HelloFresh a huge shout out for sponsoring this episode. So HelloFresh is a meal kit delivery service that shops, plans, and delivers step-by-step recipes and pre-measured ingredients so you can just cook, eat, and enjoy. They offer so many recipes to choose from each week to help you break out of your recipe rut, and there's something for everyone, including low-calorie, vegetarian, and even family-friendly recipes every week. HelloFresh cuts out stressful meal planning and grocery store trips too, so you can enjoy cooking and get dinner on the table in just about 30 minutes or even 20 minutes with their quick recipe options. And you can also easily change your delivery days or food preferences and skip a week whenever you need. The packaging HelloFresh uses to ship your food is almost entirely made from recyclable and or already recycled content, which is great for the environment. One particular recipe I personally enjoyed was the garlic and oregano halloumi tacos with lemon aioli and caramel onion. I know, seems like a bit of a weird combo, but what a treat. And my family and I had a lot of fun cooking dinner together that night too, and it was super easy to prepare. So, enjoy America's #1 meal kit today and go to hellofresh.com/80BeScared and use the code 80BeScared to get a total of $80 off, including free shipping on your first box as well. Again, that's hellofresh.com/80BeScared and use the code 80BeScared to get a total of $80 off, including free shipping on your first box. Additional restrictions apply. Please visit hellofresh.com for more details. This happened when I was much younger. I want to say freshman in high school. Probably like 2008 or something. There used to be this road near where I live though, in CA, called Croak Road. It was barely a road. No one travelled on it, and it was surrounded by small patches of forest and some abandoned barns and houses and whatnot. I would typically go there with my friends to skateboard and hang out. This one night though, I was hanging out with two of my friends, Lucas and Dorian, and someone wanted to go to Croak Road to hang out since it was creepy at night. It might sound lame, but we sort of loved exploring like a bunch of 5th graders and weren't really into smoking or anything, so what else were you to do, right? I asked my 20-year-old brother James if he could drive us down into one of the nature reserves by the road. This specific reserve was larger than the others and had a network of gravel paths leading through it. Basically, we were looking for unexplored territory to hike in. Soon, one particular path that we were travelling down had become so narrow, James's Ford Explorer couldn't pass through it, so we got out and walked for a while, chatting and just having fun. We walked through the woods for about half an hour, I'd say, until it had gotten relatively dark out and the sun was gone, at which point we sort of just turned around to head back to the car. It's now that I should mention too that despite being near a lot of subdevelopments, this patch of forest was huge. I'd say about 1,000 acres at least, and rarely visited since it was easy to get lost in, especially at night. I mean, it was a challenge getting the car turned around, but James managed it, and we were off down the road again. Dorian proposed that we turn down a different path that we had passed by earlier, since we had another 40 minutes until our parents wanted us back, and so we agreed. Down this path was a tiny pond that Dorian wanted to check out to take pictures of, since he had gotten the opportunity to visit it at night. It was pretty slow going, since this road was even worse than the main one that we were travelling on that turned off to Croak Road. 2 minutes later, we got into a slight argument. Dorian was convinced that James had taken a wrong turn, since we should have arrived at the pond by now, while James claimed that he had been driving straight the whole time. It was dark after all, but eventually we came to a fork in the road, and none of us were familiar with it. None of us knew which way to go, so we ended up just guessing and going left, hoping that both directions would ultimately lead back to the main path. None of us were scared or anything, I would say. In fact, we were actually kind of excited and intrigued. I mean, we were driving through seemingly the middle of nowhere at night on some sort of an adventure. But it was at this point that we rounded a small bend in the road and the headlights fell upon a surreal sight. Because there were 4 figures emerging from the forest and crossing the road, wearing what looked like long cloaks with the hoods up and holding flashlights. And one guy at the back of the group was dragging a large duffel bag, a human-sized duffel bag, mind you. We all froze and stopped mid-conversation, and as soon as our high beams landed on the 4 figures, they froze as well. James instantly pulled to the left and went around them. Driving past them felt like an eternity because, well, we couldn't have been going over 5 miles per hour due to the terrible condition of the road. Sitting in the passenger seat, I could see them inches beyond my window, and we were indeed wearing black robes and flashlights. I actually didn't get a good look at the bag, but judging by the way the guy was holding it, something heavy was definitely inside of it. None of us said a word until the road straightened out and we were far past these guys, at which point James muttered, "What the heck was that?" He continued down the road in silence until I heard Lucas say, "Well, what's that?" and repeat himself in a louder, panicked voice. He said, "They're coming back." I twisted around in my chair to see Lucas pointing at the back window. I could barely see anything, but about 100 yards away, we saw the beams of 4 flashlights shaking erratically. The guys were without a doubt running after us. All of us screamed at James to floor it, and he sped down the road as quickly as he could. The car was bouncing and shaking uncontrollably as we flew over berms and potholes and everything. I kept my eyes on the flashlight beams until we rounded another bend in the road and they were out of sight. And thankfully, the road did manage to take us back to the main pathway. James then gunned it down the road until we popped off by Croak Road and we just got the heck out of it. But the weirdest thing about all of this is that there couldn't have been a vehicle anywhere near those guys for at least 50 miles in either direction. We would have seen one if there had been, but we explored most of the area before and there just wasn't anywhere to pull off the road and park them like that. We didn't really say anything more until we were back at my place. We talked about it for a bit, and then my friends went home and James and I went to bed. I didn't know if we should be calling the cops or not, but James, who I would guess would be the adult in the situation, seemed reluctant, so in the end I just dropped it. I never did tell my parents too until just before writing this, and they kind of scolded me for not telling them, and that we should have contacted the authorities apparently, just to report suspicious people in the preserve. Truthfully, I don't know if that would have made much of a difference, but I still do wish to know just how the heck they got there, where they were going, and also what the heck was in that bag.
He shoved me against the thing. He goes to unbuckle his belt when glass smashed.
I was born and raised in South Carolina. It was always tough living there because I'm an African American lady. My family and I grew up in a middle, upper class neighborhood. Both my parents are immigrants who worked hard to give my siblings and I a pretty good life. But it was a Saturday evening when my parents went out on a date. They trusted that I would be able to babysit my little brother and sister. Must have been a little time for this. I wasn't worried. They left the house at around 8 and promised to be back no later than 11 p.m. Everything seemed perfectly fine at first too. My brother was in the first living room just playing on his Xbox, on the couch near him using my phone, and my sister was upstairs now and was messing around with her tablet. Now, the layout of the house was something like this. Apologies in advance, this doesn't make sense too, but you open the front door and immediately to your right you have the first living room. That leads into a dining room, which leads into the kitchen. Second, and from there you can access the backyard and a door to the garage. From the front door you can go up the stairs to the bedrooms. On one side of the hall you have my sister's bathroom, on the other the master bedroom and my brother's room there too. So I'm sitting on the couch with my brother, then hear the garage door being opened. It was only around 9 p.m. though, and I knew my parents would never come back home this early. So I got up to meet them at the door and see why, assuming that something came up. Whenever they leave, I always make sure the door to the garage is locked though, so I usually have to let them in. I walk up to the door and, just as I was about to open it, I stopped. I don't know why, but I felt kind of anxious for whatever reason. I didn't even want to open up the door until I heard that it was them. It was then that I saw the doorknob wiggle violently. I got scared and took a step back. Dad. Mum? No response. Dad? Is that you? Stop messing around. I started to get pretty scared at this point. Dad, if that's you, then please say something. You're scaring me. After I said this, it looked like the door was going to burst any moment. By this point, my brother stopped running too. I ran into the kitchen, grabbed one of the biggest knives that we had, took my brother's hand and ran upstairs. There, I grabbed my sister and ran into my brother's room. By now, I had actually heard the door burst open. I locked the door and hid my siblings in the closet while I pushed the dresser in front of it to sort of barricade it. After I did that, I sat on his bed and I called the cops. The operator got all of my details and said the cops would be there in about 5 minutes. As I sat on that bed, I'll never forget just how absolutely terrified I felt. But my mind was completely blank until I heard running up the stairs. The light sobbing in the closet from my siblings turned into fearful screams, and I had my back against the wall shaking as I held the knife in front of me. And eventually they get to the end of the hall where my brother's room is and they try to open the door. They get really angry and start banging and yelling at us to open it up. I could tell by the voice too that it was definitely a man. Eventually, he's able to bust the lock and slide the door open. We lock eyes as he tries to get past my little makeshift barricade. I get a good look at his face and features. He couldn't have been more than 5'10" and had a stocky build and a really deep voice. He had, at least to me, very obviously gotten cosmetic surgery too. His face looked incredibly artificial. His skin had this unnatural smoothness to it. He had these grossly big lips and his eyes seemed to be just a little too big almost. I was on the verge of tears when I just yelled, "Don't come any closer, the police are on you." And that seemed to stop him in his tracks. He took one last look at me when he ran down the stairs and out the front door. I immediately ran to the closet to check on my siblings and to see if they were okay. They were pretty scared, but other than that, they were all right, thankfully. I heard the police finally pull up to us. Later, an officer came in and yelled to see if we were okay. I remember being taken to the station with my siblings and calling my parents along. We did file a report, but unfortunately nothing ever came of it. I remember being so angry about it too. I mean, there just couldn't be that many people who looked like this guy. How was it so hard to find someone who left the crime scene within minutes before them arriving? I don't know, but I'm just glad that none of us were hurt that day. I was visiting my friend in Budapest that was working at a hostel. We ended up going out and drinking pretty heavily and meeting these two girls. We hung out with them through the night and offered to walk them back to their place. When we got there, my friend, who had a girl on lock, was like, I'll come back with you, Andrew. I just kept being like, dude, you've got a girl that wants you to come up to her place and it's a short walk for me to get home. Just stay. He kept saying no, and I jokingly was like, well, you can't leave with me if you can't find me, and just started running away. I'm a pretty stupid drunk, I know that, but it was funny at the time. But anyways, I ran for a few minutes and quickly lost my bearings, had an empty wallet and no phone. I just thought, crap, no wonder, spot a landmark and find my way home from there. Hell, I'll sleep on the street if I have to. I was walking for 30 minutes at this point, really, really drunk. My car pulled up and a guy yelled at me in Hungarian. I just replied, sorry man, English only, and I laughed. He was parked and I was chilling, so we talked for a few minutes. He seemed alright and was like, dude, I can take you back to your hostel if you like. I said yes to this and I went to hop in the back. And there were two guys back there that I couldn't see through the tinted windows. These guys were both super tatted up and very thug looking. I was honestly just too drunk to run if they were going to run, so I put on a brave face and I got in. I'm sobering up really fast. They start driving and I immediately realize that something is definitely going on. Basically, Budapest was two separate cities on either side of the river, Buda and Pest. We were on the Pest side, with most of the clubs and such, and we almost immediately crossed over, and I knew that I didn't live on that side. So I was kind of hey man, my hostel's in Pest. Why are you going into Buda? And they just laughed and quiet. Finally, the driver pipes up Hey man, no one knows where you were tonight. But what would you do if we tried to beat you up? Alarm. I checked the door here. I kind of feigned that you see that I rolled out my window, slightly leaning out. The whole time they're talking, saying that they could kill me. But no, I didn't even know what I was. I just remember looking at my feet and thinking, if you guys try anything tonight, I know you'll hurt me or maybe even kill me, but I promise that I'll kill one of you with me. I swear on my life that I'll make it happen. And they laughed. We keep getting further out of the city, almost to the point of the buildings. We keep going back and forth with the threats when we hit a red light. Everyone in the car was kind of at ease since they thought I was too drunk to do it. At the window, we grabbed a hand from the outside, popped the door open. I fell backwards onto the pavement, rolled, and just started running. The car was stopped for a second, but I was shouting, so they just peeled away. It was around 4 or 5 a.m. at this point, and I find some guy playing Pokemon Go. This was like when it was peak time, so there were a lot of people out there who were terrified that this bleeding drunk guy is approaching. I explained my situation, and they're super sympathetic, so they call me a cab, and I take the cab back to the hostel. All I had was 20 Canadian dollars in my wallet. I beg the driver to just take it. He does. I get to my room as the sun rises. My friend asks what happened. I just said that got kidnapped. Sleep. I'll tell you tomorrow, alright? And passed out in my bed. For the record, I'm actually a female. I'm turning 19 this year, and this story happened when I was 15. Also, I'm actually from France. So when I was 15 years old and just got into junior year, I created my first Twitter account that I deleted because of this story. Some information before I get started. I didn't tell anyone my username, either my family or my friends. My profile picture was an avatar, so no pictures of me on the account. And as for the location, I said Paris because I lived in the suburbs. I didn't have many followers too, 20 or maybe 30 if I was lucky, and I didn't follow that many people. And as such, my TL just wasn't really interesting. Now, one evening, in October, someone sent me quite a strange direct message. It was a 200 followers account, and the message was something like, "Hi, my name is Rob. I just turned 17 and wanted to know if you lived in such and such a place because I will soon move in and go to the town in the high school, and I'm looking for friends." And that place was obviously the town that I lived in. I immediately thought that something was wrong because there was nowhere in my profile that I said that. After some time of thinking, I remembered the tweet that I made weeks ago about buses. I mentioned the city, so I told myself that he must have looked up for that street or whatever it was in Twitter. His age wasn't that young, because he was 2 years ahead of my classmate. Quite frankly, I was just bored and seemed polite, so I answered him. I told him that I lived in the city and I go to the high school. The discussion was pretty natural, and we talked a lot that night, mainly about high school, about the food at the cafeteria, about the teachers, that kind of thing. But as it was getting very late, he tried to interpose some personal questions, like, do you live far away from the school, in a house or in an apartment? Do you live with both of your parents? There's 5 of you? You're not often home alone, right? I never really answered because it was way too shady for me, and unfortunately, he didn't insist. And I say unfortunately because if he did, I probably would have blocked him in the end. The next day, the same thing. We talked a lot, and he was still asking me personal questions to know me better, so I asked some too. And he always seemed like he answered honestly. I still didn't answer the questions about my house though, because he didn't need to know anything about that. This lasted for about 2 or 3 weeks, but it was enough for me to develop feelings for him. He was handsome, super kind, and it was everything that I needed at that point, because I was bullied for years. And even today, I still develop strong feelings, but most importantly, blind trust in people who are friendly to me has gone out the window for the most part. Now, in France in October, we have a 2-week-long vacation, and the day before back to school day, he finally told me that he was coming to my high school because he finally moved in with his mum, and he asked me a place to meet during the morning break. I'll admit too that I was really happy and sort of relieved to be able to finally meet him, and told him to join me in the hall. But when he understood that there would be people around, he said that he would prefer an isolated place because he was afraid that he would not recognize me and didn't want to spend the break looking for me. It was a good enough excuse for me. I know, kind of stupid, but I told him to meet me in the third floor bathroom because we weren't allowed to stay there. Disturbance. In my head, even though it was a little bit creepy, I'll admit, I still was in school, so nothing would happen to me, right? Next day, back to school day, I made myself pretty, wore my best clothes, I counted down the minutes, and finally, when break time arrived, I ran to the bathroom and waited. When he arrived, it was him. He wasn't a catfish. He looked quite like his profile picture, but I still noticed that he seemed a little bit older than he told me. I thought maybe 20 years old instead of 17. We talked a lot though, we got along really well, I was really pleased, and at the end of the break, he asked me to go to the fast food place with him for lunch. I said no in the end because I didn't have money, and I always refuse people to pay for me and whatnot. It's a principle thing. He seemed disappointed, but offered to walk me home after class. I explained to him that I have to take the bus, but that he could walk me to the bus stop if he liked to. He looked disappointed at this, again, but finally he seemed to accept it. And that's exactly what happened. And it was so great that it quickly became some kind of a routine. We met in the third floor bathroom during the morning break, and he always walked me to the bus stop after classes. Surprising fact, too, is that I never saw him in the hallways nor at the cafeteria, but I thought that at that time the building was huge and there were like at least 1,500 students in there, so if our schedules didn't coincide perfectly, there was pretty much no way that we would meet each other. This little game lasted until December, so almost a month and a half. The 14th of December, a Thursday, I think about how lonely I was, because my dad was abroad for work, my brother was always at his friend's house, my little sister was on a school trip, and my mum had work late that very night. It was very reckless of me, I know, but after weeks, I honestly thought that I could trust him. That evening, he walked me to the bus stop like normal. We both waited, and I got on the bus, waved at him, and put on my earphones. I had 2 stops before my house. It was about 17:45 in December, so it was already really dark outside, and as I got off the bus, I just, for some reason, had a really bad feeling. There was that really uncomfortable sensation in my stomach, and I felt like I was being watched. I paused my music, but kept my earphones in, so that people thought that I couldn't hear anything. And honestly, that is exactly what probably saved my life that day. I lived in a suburban neighborhood, like I said, very silent, especially at night, with no visibility on the big road the bus passed in. And when I heard footsteps behind me, I understood right away that there was somebody following me, and he was not well-intentioned. At this point, at least, I could hear that he wasn't accelerating, so he wasn't trying to catch up with me, but I couldn't guess how long it would have lasted. As quietly as possible, I tried to reach for my keys in my pocket, and when I finally pulled them out, I ran as fast as I could. The best sprint of my life, in fact. I don't know how it worked, but I managed to open and close the door before he could reach me. I then deactivated my alarm, confirmed that it was unlocked, and quickly took a good look through the glass panel on the door. It wasn't a peephole, it was like a whole window thing, so if someone wanted to see what was happening inside, they actually could. And you guessed it. It was him. A few meters away, looking at me with a really creepy look on his face. He followed me to my home, probably with a car, and he was clearly not here for a chit-chat. I still don't know why I didn't call the police. I was just totally paralyzed, and honestly, I wasn't quite sure what to think at that point. But we both stared at each other for a minute. When I took back control over my body, I ran into the kitchen to get a knife and got back to the door. And he was still there too, banging against the doorknob. I feared for a second that the glass would break, but thankfully it didn't happen. And that moment, when I was pushing against the door, praying for it not to break while he was kicking it harder and harder, was the longest moments that I've ever experienced. For maybe 5 minutes, he just eventually stopped and got around the house, knocking against every shutter, and got back to the door. He looked really angry, but then my neighbor's car reached my house, and he ran away, probably thinking that it was my mum coming home. On Twitter, he sent me 1,000 messages before I could block him. He then deleted his account, and I thought that I was done with the story. But quickly after this, some accounts which had recently been created followed me. Their ats were all a series of numbers and the first letter of his name. And as soon as I blocked one, another one would follow me. I chose to delete my account at that point because I just couldn't make it stop, and it was just too hard to endure because they were sending me dozens of insulting DMs every single day. Luckily, I talked to other people who were supposed to be this person's classmates because I hadn't seen him again in days. But not a single one had ever heard of this guy. And I'm pretty sure that this person was never even a student of this high school. That explains why I never met him apart from our daily meetings, and that's also probably why he just seemed so old. I never did hear from him again, which I'm thankful for, and I'm still asking myself, though, what exactly did he want? And what would have happened to me that night if I hadn't had that funny feeling? A little bit of backstory. When my parents dug the foundation of the house that I grew up in, they actually came upon a native burial ground. Upon finding this, they reburied the remains and called a native priest to come and bless the land. The foundation over about 50 feet to build their house in the end too. Fast forward to when I was a child, a teen. I would always hear my name being called from what sounded like family. There were a multitude of years that this went on as well, and I would seek help and understanding for what was going on. Nothing ever came of my search for answers. It was always just put off as an imagination. But here is where things started to get weird. So, I remember one night in particular. It still gives me extreme emotions thinking about it today, 12 plus years later. But I was sitting in the basement playing Call of Duty 4, home alone, as was the par with all of my paranormal experiences. And all of a sudden, crisp as day, I hear a little girl singing a song in what sounds like an ancient language. Nothing I've ever heard before, or ever again. But I sit there frozen, just listening to her, until this great amount of fear just takes over my body. I bolt up from my chair and go to walk to the stairs, and that was when it happened. It was honestly like I just walked into a deep freezer. I'm completely frozen at this point too, and I'm sure you can smell the terror on me. I was stuck there in this spot for what seemed like forever when it just suddenly went away. Later that night, I had a dream about a little girl in a white dress who was singing a song. The same girl that apparently I'd heard while playing games in my basement. This memory was stuck with me too, clear as day for the better part of the 12 years that I mentioned, always in the back of my mind. When I told people at the time what had happened, it was always just brushed off as mental illness of some sort, but I know that this just wasn't the case. Years later, I come to find out that the burial ground that is next to my house was actually a ground for kids. Big yikes. I know that my parents did all they could to put those spirits back to rest when they inevitably accidentally dug them up. But I think about that girl from time to time, and I really wonder just what her story was. If I think of any other stories that I might be able to add here, then I'll add them later. But as for that, this was my story. I'm hoping to gain understanding or possibly relate with some people on here if there are any. But thank you for listening, and I look forward to what you guys think may have happened to me. So about 5 years ago, I, male and 26, set out to travel the world. Being straight out of college, it had left me in a fair bit of debt, and so I was ever more desperate for any job that I was overqualified for, and generally depressed too. I felt isolated and alone in my small town in Washington, and found the only way to get out was to travel. My high school buddy suggested that I look into woofing and volunteering as a way to travel cheap, and so I did just that. The way it works is quite simple too. Basically, you work for around 25 hours a week on some farm for food and housing. The draw is that since the community is a bunch of cheap-ass travelers, it's quite big. It's a great way to meet new people, get outside of your comfort zone, and just let yourself live and figure life out. So fast forward 8 months, and I am now a seasoned cow turd shoveler. I started out in Washington, Oregon, and went south to California. There, I was able to save some money. I was paid under the table for some extra work and was now faced with a decision of where to go in the world. The excitement of being able to purchase a ticket to almost anywhere in the world got the best of me too. And on the advice of some stupid hippie volunteering partner, I chose it at random. I went to a randomizer website and I clicked the country button, Georgia, the country of Georgia. To say I didn't know anything about it too was an understatement. But the fear of the unknown made it exciting and exotic somehow. And so, I did it. I purchased a ticket and started browsing for a farm that could host me. There were a few options in the end, and most were pretty remote and didn't even have internet connection. I messaged every single one too, because few ever responded, and got a response from one farm on top of a mountain. The picture showed a traditional Georgian stone house with a large garden out in the back, a family with several cheerful children, grandparents having dinner, animals, and it seemed warm and inviting. The description was written in good English too, and the requirements for work seemed pretty reasonable. I was excited. After I flew to the capital, I followed the directions that they had sent to locate the farm, which wasn't an easy task. Few in Georgia speak English. The roads are pretty messed up since few have been maintained since the fall of the Soviet Union, and the country is generally poor too. It took me around 20 hours of Soviet buses and taxis and weird serpentine roads and paths to get to that desired blue pin on my map. It was a dirt path leading up to a steep hill, into a national park up to the north of the country. And there was nothing for miles on end but trees and their dead silence. As I got up that hill, I saw the house about a half a mile away on an even steeper hill, surrounded by the trees. From that viewpoint, it seemed abandoned, overgrown, brown and sort of dreary. As I walked past the gate, Geary, the apparent owner, approached me. He was a heavy, small middle-aged guy with a big smile on his face. He shook my hand and, in broken English, started to show me around. He also just stank of booze. But as he was showing me around, I noticed that there wasn't anyone there but us. I asked about his wife and kids, and he brushed that aside and said something to the extent of, "They're away right now." By this point, I'm pretty creeped out. From browsing around, it was very apparent that the farm was in deep decline. Apple trees and crops were dying, the roof of the small barn was caved in, the house itself was full of trash and smelling of mold. It was obvious that Geary was going through a very rough patch. But I wasn't going to turn around and just leave in the middle of nowhere without a plan, especially having not slept for the past 36 hours. It was evening, and after feeding me well and trying as best as he could to hold a conversation in English, Geary showed me my room on the second floor, and eventually I fell asleep. In fact, I almost immediately blacked out from the exhaustion and stress, and actually probably would have slept 10 hours if I wasn't awoken by a strange noise in the middle of the night. It sounded like something metallic and heavy was being dragged across the wooden floor. In that sort of sleepy in-between state, I listened to it for a few minutes, thought nothing of it, and eventually I just went back to sleep once it stopped. In the morning, Geary, now sober and grumpy, asked me to repair some of the windows and the doors in the house, as he himself planned to go and fetch some components in a nearby village or something. But again, I just got this weird feeling creeping down my spine. Something just wasn't right. He didn't maintain eye contact and was really evasive. There was no cell reception here, no internet. And once he left, I checked around the house to get a general idea of the place, and it became apparent that the place was hardly ever lived in. Like one of those abandoned houses. There was broken furniture, newspapers, and old photos on the floor, a shattered mirror. I took my phone and looked through the saved listings again, and that was when I noticed that the photos didn't really match either the backyard, the garden, or the walls. Geary wasn't in any of them, in fact, which meant that I was in a completely different house. At this point, I'm in full-blown panic. I pack my stuff up and start to leave when I see a group of 3 men going up that first hill. There aren't any paths that I can take, so I go behind the house and rush down this hill into the forest. After some time, I stop and listen. I hear them in the house. They're clearly looking for me, and afraid of making any noise, I just remain still, hidden behind a bush. I don't know how long I must have waited there for, but man, were they persistent. At some point, I hear them leave, so I count until some large number and proceed back into the house and path, and once I find it's all clear, I just book it the heck out of there. Never ran this fast, in fact, but I'm still in the middle of nowhere. No traffic, no public transport, nothing. Eventually, I reached a paved road and I start walking in the general direction from where I remember coming. Hours go by, but finally, a car drives by and stops. Now, in a horror movie, this would have been Geary and his friends, right? But this was actually a really nice Russian family that gave me a ride to town. But when I finally got internet access again, the listing disappeared from the website, and a few days before I left, and I haven't heard from Geary ever since. I'm yet to make sense of that experience. I've travelled since and volunteered too. Some people, once they hear the story, laugh and say that the guy was coming over with a couple of friends from the village to have a chat over a few beers or something like that. But some, they say that he was bound to kidnap and kill him. I trust my gut feeling. Something just was really not right about that place, and I'm glad that I ran when I did. This happened a few years ago when I was bartending in college. I was coming home down a stretch of divided highway at around 3 a.m. when I noticed a car heading towards me in the wrong lane. I sort of doubted myself at first and thought the car was on the other side of the highway. Sure enough, a white Ford sedan passed me at a really high speed, at least 90. It's worth noting too for later that I also drive a white Ford sedan. Now, I was used to drunk or idiot drivers in the middle of the night, so I just pulled to the side of the road and let him pass me. I had a moment of clarity and thought to call the police, thinking this person could hurt themselves or somebody else. The dispatcher answered, and after telling them which road and exit mile marker I was at, told me that they would send a car. The state police station was only a few exits away, so I figured that they would send somebody and I would just drive home. As I headed back onto the highway, I noticed some lights a few miles behind me. I live in a more rural part of southeastern PA, and traffic was very with truckers and cops. The car gained on me at speed, so I stayed in the right lane and waited to be passed. But instead, they flipped on their high beams, making it uncomfortable to drive, and rode my tailgate. At this point, I thought that I was being pulled over by the police. I drove a white Ford sedan after all, and had just called about a different white Ford sedan, so I grabbed my registration from my glove box. Suddenly, though, the car behind me audibly slammed on the brakes and stopped in the middle of the highway. They must have shut off their car though, because the lights went out, and I saw what looked like the same Ford sedan from earlier. Still, I thought this may have been a police car though, that they had a roof rack, and it could have looked like I had reached for a gun or something in my glove box, so I panicked and called 911 for the second time and asked the dispatcher if they had sent a cruiser to investigate. The dispatcher was a little curt with me this time and assured me that they had sent somebody out. Listen, we've sent a trooper out to find the car, sir. Well, I only asked because somebody's following me and acting weird. It could be a cop, and I think I freaked them out by getting my registration. Are you pulled over? No, I don't think so. They didn't turn on their lights. Let me try to get the trooper we sent out. As she was talking, the car again sped towards me and stopped inches from my bumper this time. Again, their high beams were on, and again they slammed their brakes. I told the dispatcher, I'm pretty sure this is not the police behind you. The car sped to my bumper again and turned their high beams on, this time laying on the horn. Hearing this, the dispatcher asked me what was happening. Did you honk? What's going on? No, that's the car behind me. I don't think it's a cop. I'll try to get the trooper again, but I don't think that's him behind you. For some reason, this has really shook me. Before, I was just thinking that I would get pulled over and maybe get a ticket. Until then, I was going to the speed limit and trying to avoid getting pulled over. I told the dispatcher, I don't care if I get pulled over, alright? I'm speeding, and if they put their lights on, I'll pull over. I started to accelerate, and the person behind me just kept up with me. The speed limit was 55, and they kept going up. This time, they were swerving like mad. I tried to signal for an exit and bail on it, but she followed me. At the next exit, it took me off with it, continued on to the on-road. I followed the car to the I thought about trying to go to a convenience store or a gas station, but the dispatcher thought that that would probably be unsafe. She was calm and talking to another person trying to send police to me. The other person, maybe a supervisor or something, asked if I could drive to the state police station. Realizing that I was an accident too, I told her I was coming there. But she said that she would have troopers with her outside. The accident. I blew a few red lights trying to get to the police station. The car tried to pull into another lane to pass me and pull up on the side. Once the police station was in, the turn signal, the car slammed on its brakes and turned off their lights, turned into a parking lot. Fortunately, too, I was oriented and interconnected. I pulled into the police station with the troopers. Two of them went to my car. I stayed with the third. I thanked the dispatcher and her supervisor, and the state trooper escorted me home after taking a statement from her. I was never called to follow up or testify too, so I can only assume that the person never got caught. Years ago, I went camping for the first time in my life. I was about 11 or 12 when we headed out to the coast of the house. We were in Poland for the holidays. To our house was a huge forest. One day, we decided to take out the she still had from her to stay for the night. Two,